2,000 years ago, very few people could read or write. General estimates placed the literacy rate below 10% of the global population. Today we know literacy has been tied to economic growth and life satisfaction. When a population is literate, it creates more critically thinking individuals who have more opportunities and can generate more skills. But for most of history, the overwhelming majority of people were kept in the dark and lacked access to this valuable skill. Literacy was a skill for the rich and the elites. The poor rarely had a chance to gain it. And so they were often kept in their positions for generations with no way out. But then one day, a new religion began to spread around the world. Many of its evangelists desired greatly that all converts be able to hear God's word, or even read it for themselves. As its influence grew, a new era slowly emerged, where literacy became the norm. And without this religion, we may never have entered a time when most people could read and write. This is the story of how Christianity educated the world. In the ancient world, texts were used by the bureaucratic elites. They were not for the masses. Joshua Berman notes the text of the Enuma Elish was never seen by the common man. This was a text for the priests and the elites of their society, to be used in religious rituals. Commoners did have access to texts inscribed on monuments, but few could read them. The purpose of monumental texts was for royal display of power, not to provide the masses with written words. In Egypt, texts were guarded and reserved for members of the upper class. It is likely that less than 1% of the Egyptian population ever knew how to read. The Ipuwer Papyrus laments that commoners have access to texts and can now speak openly the spells held within them. Texts were read out loud to the public from time to time, but these were mostly not long-duration texts or narratives, but more often administrative texts detailing changes in rulership or political dealings the public had to be made aware of. But things were different in the Hebrew Scriptures, which eventually, with the combination of the New Testament, would ignite a cultural revolution of literacy. Joshua Berman notes in the Hebrew Bible, we see the Torah is to be written down and taught to the people of Israel so that they can learn what it says. Not only that, but other biblical passages speak of public readings from the Torah. Jeremiah speaks of Baruch reading his words to the people. Habakkuk refers to his words being read to larger audiences. Isaiah instructs that we read from the book of the law. The Torah assumes that the people of Israel are to be read its contents, and it speaks of the people themselves as in covenant with God and meant to understand what is required of them. Israel is called to become a wise and discerning nation and a kingdom of priests. There is no distinction between the elites and the common folk in this sense. Fathers are called to educate their children and teach them the law of God and the story of the Exodus. Therefore, all are called to be an educated people within Israel. Berman says, the Bible sees the oral textual education system whereby the literate read the text for the consumption of others, as encompassing the whole of Israel. It is telling that the Bible never depicts priests or scribes as jealous or protective of their writing skills. The notion of scribes feeling threatened lest serfs become the owner of serfs, or that it is a tragedy if divine knowledge falls into the wrong hands, as Ipuwer put it in the Egyptian Middle Kingdom passage, is alien to biblical thought. Within the vision of the Pentateuch, reading and writing were not viewed as the exclusive domain of a scribal class and ruling court, as was the case for Israel's neighbors. The importance of the written word is also at the center of the Israelite religion. In the ancient pagan world, the idol, or image of the god, was the central focus of the cultic worship. Graven images of God are forbidden in the Torah, and instead, what is at the center that represents God's immanence in the world are the written tablets of the Ten Commandments. The way to encounter God and feel His immanence is through written texts, which subtly suggests reading is central to knowing God. Berman says, the locus of worship in the sanctuary is not a graven image, but the graven tablets that bear the signature of the Almighty. the sample of the divine word, written in the divine hand, tucked away in the Ark of the Covenant, underscores the primary way Israel is to encounter the divine, through God's written words. In the New Testament, reverence for the written word can also be observed. Jesus constantly refers to the Hebrew Scriptures as important texts that should be read or studied. Paul and the apostles sent out several letters that were meant to be read in the churches and for the whole congregation to hear. Paul even says that he hopes the Colossians will read a letter he has sent to another church, which suggests a Christian practice was to share texts so others could study them. In Acts 17, it says, "Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so." The teaching of this verse is that it is noble to read and study the Scriptures, and that we ought to fact-check claims to verify that they are true. So it is clear that one of the main focuses within the Judeo-Christian tradition is the importance of reading. This is also not a practice reserved for the elites of society. All should seek and find God by reading His Word. Learning to read is not only good, it is an important way to encounter God. It follows that out of the Christian tradition, we should expect to see literacy increase and the encouragement of reading, and this is precisely what we find. First, we observe a desire for Christian scriptures to be sent around to as many churches as possible, suggesting they wanted them to be read by as many as possible. The early Christians adopted the Codex, an early form of the book, for copying and spreading around sacred texts. Marshall wrote that the Codex was more compact and handy for a traveler. Codices are also easier to navigate through, as one can flip through pages quicker than one can unravel a scroll. While pagan codices were rare in the 2nd century, the Codex form was universal for Christian texts. Because the Christians adopted a form of a text that was easier to spread around and use when teaching, this suggests that Christians were heavily focused on the importance of reading and on distributing sacred texts to as many as possible. They also likely contributed to the Roman world moving to the Codex and away from the scroll. Second, many early church fathers not only encouraged the reading of Scripture, but also studying the Greek classics. Now, some Christian authors dissented and taught to reject pagan works, but they were the clear minority. Most church fathers encouraged Christians to study the classics. Tertullian seemed to have disdain for pagan texts, but he also said, "Let us see then the necessity of literary erudition. Let us reflect that partly it cannot be admitted, partly cannot be avoided. Learning literature is allowable for believers." Clement of Alexandria taught that before the coming of Christ, philosophy was necessary and helped the Greeks obtain righteousness. It was still useful, but the Christian scriptures were superior. Clement openly encouraged the study of pagan texts, as Christians can learn from them. John Chrysostom said that parents should constantly flood their sons' ears with talk of both pagan and Christian men of old who practiced self-restraint. In other words, select pagan stories were useful to learn from and read about. St. Basil also taught non-Christian works were useful. Everything we do is by way of preparation for the other life. Whatever therefore contributes to that life, we say must be loved and pursued with all our strength, but what does not conduce to that must be passed over as of no account. We find a similar mentality in the writings of Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, Augustine, and Jerome. The Church created a culture that fostered and encouraged reading. As L.D. Reynolds and N.G. Wilson say, early church fathers of the highest authority were content that Christians should read some pagan texts during their education. The outlook of the fathers of the 4th century was no less liberal. St. Basil wrote a short treatise advising the young on the best method of profiting from Greek literature. And St. Gregory of Nazianzus criticized the majority of Christians for their complete rejection of pagan works, some of which he believed to be useful. There was in general no attempt to alter the school curriculum by banishing the classical authors. Out of these teachings from Scripture and the Church Fathers, we see Christians aim to educate as many as they could. Children in antiquity often ended up as orphans. The Church created orphanages to care for abandoned children and children whose parents had died. monasteries were often turned into orphanages out of necessity. From various documents, we read that monks not only cared for children under their protection, but taught them to read and gain a basic education. In general, monasteries commonly accepted children, both orphans and non-orphans, and the primary purpose of child oblation was to have the child educated. The education they received in monasteries was far above that which orphans could obtain otherwise. Orphans in monasteries customarily also were educated in crafts, ensuring their ability to make a living as adults. This culture that encouraged literacy and reading continued to grow throughout the Middle Ages. After a period of many wars, natural disasters, and turmoil, the Byzantine state began to flourish once again in the 9th century. The assistant emperor Bardas revived the imperial university. Great men like Leo the mathematician made advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Most importantly, though, his school developed a smaller and more efficient script that took up less space and could be copied quicker. This allowed for the copying of more books to be spread around and read. Around the same time, two brothers, Cyril and Methodius, were missionaries to the Slavic people. The Slavs lacked a written language, which meant they were unable to read Christian scriptures and liturgical texts in their own tongue. The two brothers developed the Glagothic alphabet for the Slavic people and worked to educate many to read and write. But their primary motivations for doing this were religious. They desired for the Slavs to read about Christianity, and without such an underlying motive, it is unlikely such a monumental task would have ever been carried out. Centuries earlier, Christians developed the Armenian, Coptic, and Gothic alphabets for similar reasons. They also developed, refined, and standardized the Ge'ez script for liturgical and religious purposes. In the West, the scholar Alcuin of York became an advisor to Emperor Charlemagne. Their desire was to create a true Christian people, but they said this could not happen without education. For although correct conduct may be better than knowledge, nevertheless, knowledge precedes conduct. Tom Holland notes that Alcuin wished that everyone could share in the fruits of Christian learning. With Charlemagne's funding, monasteries under Alcuin's leadership became centers of learning and provided education to as many as possible. From their desire to make the people more Christian, they consequently felt the need to increase education rates. It was not enough to take the light of Christ into the forests of Saxony. It had to be taken into the manors and farms and small holdings of Francia. An entire society needed reform. Alcuin also made advances with the alphabet by helping to develop the Carolinginian minuscule, which combined Roman cursive elements with uniformity, making it ideal for copying manuscripts. It featured distinct lowercase letters in forms we recognize today and became the foundation for the modern lowercase alphabet. This helped them educate and copy text efficiently. Additionally, L.D. Reynolds and N.G. Wilson note the Carolinginian age consumed a staggering amount of parchment. There was a tremendous spate of publication, ranging from creative poetry through history, biography, hagiography, theology, philosophy, and biblical exegesis, to the handbooks on rhetoric, dialectic, metrics, and grammar. Despite myths about this period, there was a plethora of books available. Many were lost due to time, Viking invasions, or other turmoil, but the evidence suggests this was a period when reading was widespread and celebrated. Thus, the evidence shows us the initial culture created by Christianity led to increased literacy and education. Christians were so fixated on this, they developed written languages for other people groups and new forms of scripts to generate more copies of books. Now, it is true that Christians at times burned books, but this was not the norm. When books were burned, they were mostly heretical works. But even though this occurred, many heretical works were preserved for study. Photius I of Constantinople wrote that he read heretical works and anti-Christian writers, which suggests they were available for study in the 9th century. Meanwhile, the classical Greek works were taught and preserved. As L.D. Reynolds and N.G. Wilson say, it is sometimes asserted that the Church formally imposed a censorship and burnt pagan books as a matter of policy. The policy, if it ever existed as such, took a long time to have its intended effect. In the 7th century, the poems of Sappho were still being read in Egypt. Occasionally, there is a report of the burning of pagan books. Jovian in 363-4 is said to have burned a library assembled at Antioch by his predecessor Julian, but this was an isolated case of vindictiveness. There is no reliable evidence for censorship. A famous statement by the humanist Petros Alkiones, to the effect that the ecclesiastical authorities caused the texts of pagan poets to be burnt, is not supported by any other evidence. It derives from a remark by the Byzantine refugee Demetrius Chalcondyles, and there is no reason to think that he had special sources of information. The numerous authors mentioned had probably been lost through other causes by the end of the Dark Ages. At the dawn of the second millennium, Western Europeans began to rediscover many lost texts found in the East and Islamic world, which they took with delight and made copies to share across Europe. A combination of relative peace, more reading material, and a culture that encouraged education led to a new type of institution. Centers of learning existed before Christianity, but in Christian Europe, the independent university was created, which was an institution dedicated to research with its own governing board that was not beholden to a king, pope, or wealthy benefactor. This new type of university was free to pursue its own interests. James Hannam says, "The schools of Alexandria and Constantinople were both royal foundations that depended on the whim of the monarch for money and patronage. In contrast, the new universities of Western Europe enjoyed a special kind of status that made them effectively independent. The first was created in Bologna in 1088, and the concept quickly spread across Europe, with universities being established in several nations. The historian Edward Grant has estimated that as many as 750,000 gained some sort of university experience before the Reformation." L.D. Reynolds and N.G. Wilson note literacy began to become widespread among the lower classes. Likewise, Seb Folk says, "Literacy was not rare in medieval England, as is often assumed. Around half the population had a basic level, sufficient to read a familiar prayer." Literacy rates were increasing, but this was only accelerated with the Reformation and the invention of the printing press. Joshua Berman says, "The Reformation called on parents to conduct family services, to catechize children and apprentices, and to engage in Bible study in the home. What had formerly been the purview of the priest within the church was now brought home. The Geneva Study Bible of 1599 notes that masters in their houses ought to be as preachers to their families." Martin Luther greatly encouraged that all Christians read the Bible daily. To facilitate such a demand, he encouraged governing officials to place schools in all towns to provide education for boys and girls. Parents were also called to be active in the education of their children. Luther believed ignorance was a terrible superstition that could be dealt with through education. Even if there was no soul, as I've already said, and men did not need schools and the languages for the sake of Christianity and the scriptures, still, for the establishment of the best schools everywhere, both boys and girls, this consideration is of itself sufficient, namely that society, for the maintenance of civil order and the proper regulation of the household, need accomplished and well-trained men and women." Following Luther's advice, by 1530, state officials were establishing schools wherever they had authority. Luther boasted these schools were much more humane, saying, "Our schools are no longer hell or purgatory, in which with much flogging, trembling, anguish, and wretchedness they learn nothing." These schools not only taught from Christian texts, but also a host of other subjects. C. John Somerville says, "The Duchy of Württemberg has the distinction of establishing by 1560 the first educational system in history, consisting of a network of elementary schools for both sexes, which fed into Latin grammar schools for boys only. Their students were introduced to the new learning of the Renaissance. Some would go on to the university to prepare for the professions. Other Protestant states recognized the desirability of such schemes. Scotland struggled against its poverty to set up a system of schools that would reach all children, as Massachusetts Bay would do a century later. Protestants quoted the same authorities as did the humanists, Plato, Cicero, Plutarch, Quintilian, and Jerome, and they said the same things about stimulating children to want to learn, adding the same warnings against the overuse of corporal punishment. In general, they acted as if education could help produce Christian character. Catholics retaliated by increasing the amount of education they offered. The Ursula Sisters were formed, which focused on educating girls. Somerville notes the Jesuits became famous educators who became the standard by which other schools measured their success. They utilized games, had children produce plays, and introduced dancing as a form of education. By the end of the 7th century, roughly 800 of these schools were scattered across Europe. James Simpson notes this new mentality created by the Reformation, combined with the invention of the printing press, led to an intense reading culture. The effects of this were documented in a 2007 study, which found that the push for literacy, ignited by the Reformation, was purely religiously motivated, and it resulted in more economic progress. It turns out that Protestants' higher literacy can account for roughly the whole gap in economic outcomes between the two denominations. In fact, the extent of economic progressiveness of Protestant counties attributable to higher literacy is slightly larger than their actual progressiveness, at least in terms of the size of the manufacturing sector. In other words, not only do we see Christianity directly increase literacy rates in education, but this in turn led to more economic progress, which made the lives of Europeans much better. As Christianity grew over the past few centuries, missionaries have worked tirelessly to expand the church. With this as their goal, they continued the Christian tradition of expanding education as a necessary part of this process. It was not enough to simply convert people. New converts should be literate and educated so they can study the Bible for themselves. Alden Vaughan covered the history of the Puritans in New England in the 17th century. Despite many modern myths about this period, research indicates the Puritans were very generous to the American Indians of the region. They obviously were not perfect, but due to their Christian convictions, they worked to convert the native population, which included coming up with a written alphabet for Algonquian, building schools and churches for tribes, and providing education wherever they could. In fact, many of the written languages that exist today are the result of Christian missionaries creating them, so native people can read the Bible in their own language. It is likely that Christians have been involved in the creation or improvement of hundreds of written languages, so people around the world can read the Bible in their own tongue. Organizations like Wycliffe Bible Translators and SIL International have been involved in the creation of many of them. Portions of the Bible have been translated into over 3,600 languages, and the whole Bible in roughly 750 languages. Today, 81% of people have access to the Bible in their own language, and the main reason for this is because missionaries throughout the ages have desired to educate people around the world. In fact, several studies have been published showing Christian missionaries are positively associated with the regions having higher literacy rates and more education. Robert Woodbury concluded after running an OLS model that conversionary Protestants were a crucial catalyst initiating the development and spread of religious liberty, mass education, mass printing, newspapers, voluntary organizations, and colonial reforms, thereby creating the conditions that made stable democracy more likely. One study that looked at China found that Protestantism has generated significant positive effects in long-term economic growth, educational development, and healthcare outcomes. In 1860, there were 198 foreign Protestant missionaries and only 2,000 converts. By 1900, there were over 1,500 missionaries and more than 80,000 Protestant converts. The study found that a greater Protestant presence results in better education and healthcare outcomes in 1920, and that these effects persisted into the present and contributed to economic growth in 2000. Similar results were found in India. Another study found that on average, regions that had Protestant missionaries were associated with a 2.5% increase in the total population literacy rate. The exposure to Protestant missions during the colonial period translates into higher literacy rates today. Historians highlight the important role of Protestant missionaries in promoting literacy among traditionally disadvantaged groups in India, women and low castes. Consistently, I find that women and low caste members living in Protestant districts display significantly higher literacy rates relative to the same social groups living in non-Protestant areas. Another study found that in India, Christian missionary activity is consistently associated with better female education outcomes in both the colonial and post-colonial periods. Despite facing native resistance, missionaries worked tirelessly to educate girls alongside boys. By 1931, Christians in India surpassed Sikh, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, and tribal communities in overall literacy. Muslims had on average 15 per 1,000 literate girls. Hindus had 21 per 1,000. Christians dwarfed these numbers by having 203 per 1,000 literate girls. Colonial censuses indicate that where Protestants had been active, there were superior female education outcomes. Similar results were found in Africa. One study found, the evidence we obtained from a variety of identification strategies is consistent with our hypothesis that the early introduction of the printing press has long-term effects on contemporary civic and social capital. A wide literature points to higher social capital, leading to higher economic activity and higher well-being. Another study found that Christian missionaries were central agents in the development of the educational systems in former African colonies. In most former colonies, the first schools were founded by missionaries. The paper found that in specific African regions before 1960, the odds of a Christian being literate rather than illiterate is 9 times higher than for a non-Christian. After 1960, it is 4 times more likely. Islamic regions were hostile to missionaries and prevented them from building schools. In places like West Africa, education tended to decrease due to historic Islamic control. In contrast, in the region of the Gold Coast, 90% of students were enrolled in mission schools, which led to higher educational achievement. We looked at these studies and more in an earlier video. Christian missionaries were responsible for creating hundreds of written languages for people, increasing literacy, education, and a host of several other benefits. Without Christianity, the world as we know it would be a less educated and developed place. Even when we look at schools today in the West, we see Christianity results in better education. Meta-analyses have found that Christian schools, when compared to public and non-religious schools, result in higher academic achievements, better scores on standardized tests, and better school-related behavior. The data from multiple areas all points to the same conclusion. Christianity results in higher literacy and more education. The world would not be where it is today if not for the gospel. Today, approximately 86% of people aged 15 and older are illiterate. Christianity has greatly contributed to this astonishing increase of only 10% of the world being literate 2,000 years ago. Of course, other factors and non-Christians have contributed to this growth of literacy. But regardless, Christianity has been a major driving force for increasing this number. The main reason most people can read today has a lot to do with the Bible. No other book has generated so much progress. Without it, we would never have come this far. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.